The memo was found buried in a presidential library, handwritten, and dated 1944, and it proved everything. Here is a black man from Philadelphia who has been recommended for a suitable award. This is a big enough award so that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys. The Medal of Honor, approved. Ready for President Roosevelt to present. For a 21-year-old medic who spent 30 hours on Omaha Beach, saving over 200 lives while his own blood soaked into the sand. For a man who amputated limbs under machine gun fire, who pulled drowning soldiers from the surf even as he collapsed from his wounds. For the greatest combat medic in D-Day history, he never received it. Instead, Corporal Waverly Woodson got a Bronze Star. Then he was forgotten, erased from history, and when his family finally found proof of what he was owed, the Army had the perfect excuse. A fire in 1973 had conveniently destroyed his records. This is the story of American heroism, American racism, and a debt that's been unpaid for 80 years. The train windows had to stay shuttered, not for privacy, but for protection. In December 1942, as Corporal Waverly Woodson traveled from Pennsylvania to Camp Tyson, Tennessee, he learned his first lesson about the army he'd volunteered to defend. The curtains weren't to shield white passengers from seeing black soldiers. They were to keep white civilians from shooting at them. Woodson had left Lincoln University in his sophomore year, abandoning pre-med studies to enlist. He'd scored exceptionally high on his aptitude tests, high enough to qualify for Anti-Aircraft Artillery Officer Candidate School. He was one of only 2 black men in the entire program. But before he could complete the course, his superiors delivered the news. The Coast Artillery Corps could not billet him. The reason was simple, stated matter-of-factly, his race. So Waverly Woodson, who dreamed of becoming a surgeon, was retrained as a combat medic and assigned to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, an all-black unit under white officers, the only African-American combat unit that would storm the beaches on D-Day. Camp Tyson in Tennessee was a different world. Black soldiers had separate barracks, separate mess halls, constant harassment from white military police. In June 1943, a black soldier from the 320th named Herman Hankins was shot in the back off base. Everyone knew what happened to black men in Tennessee who looked at white people the wrong way. But the 320th had a mission to master. Barrage balloons, massive hydrogen-filled spheres that would float 200 feet above the beaches, tethered by steel cables armed with 4-pound bombs. If a German plane snagged a cable at 300 miles per hour, the bomb would detonate, blowing off a wing or igniting the fuel tank. The training was brutal. The racism was constant. German prisoners of war ate at camp restaurants, while black American soldiers had to wait or leave entirely. One soldier later recalled, "Our biggest enemy was our own troops." In November 1943, the 320th shipped to England. The contrast was shocking. British families invited them into their homes. They discovered freedoms they'd never known in their own country. When British military police tried to bar black soldiers from a pub under American pressure, the British rioted against their own police. The US response? Court-martial 32 black soldiers. Then came D-Day. Corporal Waverly Woodson wasn't supposed to land in the first wave. His landing craft tank, LCT-856, should have arrived later, in a support role. But at approximately 5:30 a.m. on June the 6th, everything went wrong. About 2 miles from shore, LCT-856 hit a submerged mine. The vessel lost all power. Dead in the water, the tide dragged them toward Omaha Beach, while German 88mm guns zeroed in. An 88mm shell struck directly. The explosion lifted the entire ship out of the water. The Sherman tank on board erupted into flames. Of the 26 Navy personnel aboard, 25 were killed instantly. Shrapnel tore through Woodson's groin, inner thigh, and back. He reached down and brought his hand back, covered in blood. His first thought, "I'm dying." Another medic patched his wounds quickly, just enough to keep him conscious. Then the ramp dropped. Bodies floated in the water. Men screamed for help. Machine gun fire chewed the surf into foam. Mines detonated, throwing soldiers into the air. The water ran red. Woodson waded through chest-high water, his own blood mixing with the ocean and the blood of hundreds of dying men. He reached a rocky embankment near German defensive position WN-61. Using the stones as cover, he established an aid station. Then, bleeding from his untreated wounds, he went to work. A soldier with a bullet lodged in his chest. Woodson cut it out. A man with a shattered leg. He reset the bone. Another with an artery severed. Clamp, suture, pressure. A private with his intestines exposed. Woodson cleaned the wound, applied sulfur powder, bandaged him tight. The work was endless. For every man he stabilized, 2 more crawled or were dragged to his position. He dispensed blood plasma to soldiers in shock. He removed bullets from dozens of bodies. He bandaged gaping holes that exposed bone and organ. And when a soldier's right foot was so badly mangled that amputation was the only option, Woodson amputated it. On a beach, under fire, with basic surgical tools. German fire never stopped. Mortar shells exploded around his aid station. Machine gun rounds kicked up sand inches from where he worked. Men died before he could reach them. Others died in his hands. But Woodson kept working. His own wounds bled through their bandages. Pain radiated through his body. Blood loss made him dizzy. He ignored it all, because soldiers kept arriving, and they kept screaming for a medic. For 30 continuous hours, Corporal Waverly Woodson performed battlefield surgery under the worst conditions imaginable. He treated over 200 wounded men. In a hell of fire and steel and blood, a 21-year-old medic from Philadelphia became the anchor point between life and death for hundreds of American soldiers. By 4:00 p.m. on June the 7th, Woodson was barely conscious. Finally, another medic ordered him to seek treatment. As he walked toward evacuation, he saw 3 British soldiers in the surf. Their landing craft had drifted into deep water. All 3 had gone under. Woodson, barely able to stand, rushed into the water. He pulled each man out, performed artificial respiration until they coughed and gasped for air. All 3 survived. Only then did Waverly Woodson allow himself to be evacuated to a hospital ship. The Army issued a press release calling Woodson a modest Negro-American soldier, cited for extraordinary bravery on D-Day. Stars and Stripes declared he covered himself with glory. The Pittsburgh Courier called him no one invasion hero. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower praised the 320th's courage. But more significantly, Woodson's commanding officer recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross. Then the office of General John C. H. Lee in Britain upgraded it to the Medal of Honor. A handwritten note discovered decades later in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library documents what happened next. Written by Phileo Nash to a White House aide. Here is a Negro from Philadelphia who has been recommended for a suitable award. He was first recommended by his commanding officer for a Distinguished Service Cross, but General Lee's officers said the act merited a congressional medal. This is a big enough award so that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys. The memo was dated 1944. It explicitly states Woodson deserved the Medal of Honor, that it should be presented by President Roosevelt himself. It never happened. Instead, Waverly Woodson received a Bronze Star, the 4th highest military decoration, an award for meritorious service rather than extraordinary heroism. Of the more than 400 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not a single one went to a black soldier, despite more than 1.2 million African Americans serving in the conflict. The message was clear. Black heroism, no matter how extraordinary, was not worthy of the nation's highest honor. After the war, the 320th returned to Camp Stewart, Georgia. White soldiers greeted them with racial slurs. The same men who had helped save Europe were treated like criminals in their own country. Woodson tried to pursue medical school, but in the 1950s, very few accepted black applicants. Unable to become the surgeon he'd dreamed of being, he worked as director of the morgue at Walter Reed Medical Center, then spent 28 years at the National Institutes of Health. In his Maryland community, he was known as Doc Woodson, treating families who couldn't find black doctors. He married Joanne in 1952. They had 3 children. For decades, he barely spoke about D-Day. The memories were too painful, not just the horror, but the knowledge of what should have been recognized and wasn't. In 1994, France invited Woodson to Normandy for D-Day's 50th anniversary. They presented him with the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration, the first time a foreign government acknowledged what his own country refused to recognize. I guess it bothered him some that his own country never honored him the way the French did, his wife Joanne said later. Waverly Woodson died on August 12, 2005, at age 83. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His simple marble headstone looks like 400,000 others. He died without ever receiving the Medal of Honor. But in 2015, journalist Linda Hervier published Forgotten, the untold story of D-Day's black heroes. Her research uncovered that memo in the Truman Library, the smoking gun proving Woodson had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. Hervier's work reignited the campaign. Woodson's widow Joanne, then in her 90s, began working with Senator Chris Van Hollen. The Congressional Black Caucus joined the effort. Bills were introduced to posthumously award Woodson the Medal of Honor. The Army's response? They needed more corroborating evidence. Eyewitness accounts, documentation, primary source material. There was a problem. On July 12, 1973, a fire broke out at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The building housed over 52 million military personnel files. It lacked sprinkler systems and adequate firewalls. The fire burned for 22 hours. Between 16 and 18 million military personnel records were destroyed. 80% of Army records for personnel discharged between 1912 and 1960 were gone forever, including, almost certainly, Waverly Woodson's complete file. No duplicate copies had been made, no microfilm, no index. The records were simply erased from history. The Army pointed to the fire as the reason they couldn't verify Woodson's Medal of Honor recommendation, despite the memo, despite the 1944 press release, despite eyewitness accounts, despite General Lee's documented upgrade. In 1997, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans after an Army study concluded systematic racism had denied black soldiers recognition they deserved. Waverly Woodson was not among them. For the second time, Waverly Woodson was forgotten. But Captain Kevin Braflat, the first Army historian, refused to give up. For years, he sifted through approximately 415 feet of Army records, building a case document by document. On June 3, 2024, almost 80 years after D-Day, soldiers of the First Army held a ceremony on Omaha Beach. They laid a World War II-era Distinguished Service Cross on the sand near WN61, the exact spot where Woodson had saved over 200 lives. On September 24, 2024, that medal was presented to Joanne Woodson at a ceremony in Washington. She was 95 years old. Her son Stephen stood beside her. The room was packed with family wearing T-shirts with Woodson's photo. 1944 D-Day U.S. Army Medic. Senator Van Hollen addressed the crowd directly. Only one thing stood between him and the recognition he deserved, and that was the color of his skin. The Distinguished Service Cross is the Army's second highest honor. It's an immense honor, but everyone in that room knew it wasn't the medal recommended in 1944. It wasn't what General Lee's office approved. It wasn't what the White House memo said should be given, as he has in the case of some white boys. Captain Braflat is still searching. For me and for the First Army, he told reporters, the hunt continues. The 1973 fire that destroyed Woodson's records had been preventable. Officials feared water damage from sprinklers more than fire, so they built a massive records facility without basic fire safety. When the fire started, the records stored in cardboard boxes burned like kindling. The fire didn't discriminate by race, but its consequences did. For white soldiers whose records burned, the default assumption was honorable service. For black soldiers like Woodson, whose recommendations had already been systematically ignored, the fire provided a convenient excuse to deny them forever. The memo in the Truman Library exists because Someone outside the military system documented it. Without that memo, we would have no proof Woodson had been recommended for the Medal of Honor at all. How many other black soldiers were recommended for recognition that was never awarded? How many acts of valor were documented only in the files that burned? We'll never know. The answers burned with the records. On June 6, 1944, a 21-year-old black medic performed one of the most extraordinary acts of battlefield medicine in American military history. He saved over 200 lives. He was nominated for the Medal of Honor. A White House aide was informed the president should present it personally, and America said no, not explicitly. There was no memo saying, "Deny this because he's black." There didn't need to be. The system worked exactly as designed. Recommendations upgraded but never processed. Paperwork lost. Records destroyed. Enough obstacles that the outcome was guaranteed without anyone stating the reason out loud. Waverly Woodson's story reveals how institutional racism works. Not through dramatic confrontations, but through bureaucratic decisions that all point in the same direction. Toward forgetting, toward erasure, toward ensuring black heroism remains unrecognized. If you watch Saving Private Ryan or The Longest Day, you won't see the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The barrage balloons are visible in some shots, but the only black combat unit to storm the beaches on D-Day has been erased from the story, just like their greatest hero was erased from the honors he earned. On Omaha Beach that day, the United States suffered approximately 3,700 casualties. Woodson personally treated between 5 and 7% of all American casualties on the bloodiest beach of D-Day. One man, one medic, working under impossible conditions with untreated wounds. In a 1994 interview, Woodson was asked about the lack of recognition. His response was telling. "They don't give it to you. There were none given during the Second World War. For 30 years, they never gave a black man the Congressional Medal of Honor." He understood exactly what had happened and why. Woodson didn't storm Omaha Beach for glory. He did it because wounded men were screaming for help, and he was a medic. 3 days after evacuation, he requested to return to treat more soldiers. That's who he was. A healer who couldn't stop himself from trying to save lives. He lived his life with quiet dignity, never complaining publicly about the honor he was denied. He became Doc Woodson to his community. He taught anatomy. He supervised laboratories. He raised his children. He loved his wife. He carried the memory of Omaha Beach silently, the way so many veterans carry their wars. But silence doesn't equal acceptance, and dignity doesn't require accepting injustice. Joanne Woodson, speaking at her husband's ceremony, said it simply. Waverly would have felt honored to be recognized for what he knew was his duty, but we all know it was far more than duty. It was his desire to always help people in need. That desire took him into the surf of Omaha Beach under withering fire. It kept him working for 30 hours while his wounds bled. It drove him to save 3 drowning British soldiers as he collapsed from exhaustion. It defined every day of his life after the war. America owes Waverly Woodson a debt it has refused to pay for 8 decades. The Distinguished Service Cross is a down payment, but the full debt won't be settled until the Medal of Honor is placed on his grave, until his name is added to the roll of America's highest honors, until every American knows the story of the D-Day hero who was erased. Because Waverly Woodson's heroism on June 6, 1944, wasn't a matter of opinion. It was documented by his commanding officer, verified by General Lee's office, confirmed by a White House aide, praised in Army press releases, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers whose lives he saved. 80 years later, Corporal Waverly Woodson is still waiting for the recognition he was promised, still waiting for the medal that was recommended and approved, still waiting for America to honor its greatest D-Day medic. The wait continues, but so does the fight, because some debts can never be forgotten, and some heroes refuse to stay erased.